You are now listening to the Going North podcast, where you'll receive tips and technique to advance yourself. I'm your host, Dom Brightman, and every week we're going to be hearing from an author who's going to share their expertise to help you charge forward in life. On a quick side note, be sure to check out Going North the book. It's available in ebook, audio, as well as paperback form for those who love to read a traditional book. Now let's get on with the show. And today on the Going North podcast, we have, you guessed it, another author, but not just any author. This wonderful author right here is the author of the new book, John E. Fetzer and the Quest for the New Age. He is a professor of the American Religious History in the Department of Comparative Religion at Western Michigan University. And it was in his years in the Peace Corps that he developed a fascination with religion. That was initially fueled what he experienced of the ancient religion of the Maya and of Roman Catholicism. Returning to the U.S., Wilson completed a Ph.D. in religious studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he studied religion in the United States. And in 1993, he co-authored a book on new religious movements in California. And after moving to WMU, Wilson wrote an award-winning book on serial inventor and the leading Seventh-day Adventist of his time, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. And based on his success of that book, the Fetzer Institute invited Wilson to write a full-length spiritual biography of its founder, John E. Fetzer. So this author right here knows a lot about success, because John E. Fetzer is the Kalamazoo-based radio pioneer, media mogul, and longtime owner of the Detroit Tigers baseball team. But out of his many pursuits, however, there is one that is not well known and that we're looking forward to learning more about: his lifelong spiritual search, which has led him from traditional Christianity to an exploration of a variety of metaphysical religions, culminating in the New Age. And in this book, The Quest for a New Age, Wilson not only explores the evolution of Fetzer's beliefs, but how he puts them into action by permanently endowing 3 funds that will foster research into the scientific/spiritual interface for years to come. So give it up, folks, for the wonderful Brian C. Wilson. How are you today, sir?
Doing very good. Great to be with you.
Oh, yes, sir, indeed. Yes, sir, indeed. So writing biographies for 2 great folks who've done a lot on the planet while they were here, and they still have some great things going on long after they're gone, and it's great we got folks like you just keeping the knowledge of their works afloat.
Thank you, yes.
Yeah, so I've read most of that wonderful biography, but mind filling in the gaps of who was John E. Fetzer?
Sure. John Fetzer was originally from Indiana. He was born in a small town in Indiana, and very early in life he became fascinated with radio and decided to devote his life to being a radio engineer. And at a certain point, he got a chance to actually buy a radio station in Michigan, which he moved to Kalamazoo, and this was in the 1930s. And he turned that radio station into a network of radio stations around Michigan, and then he branched out into TV and cable, and then, of course, he bought the Detroit Tigers, and he owned that team for 30 years. So he was tremendously successful as a businessman. By the time he died, he was one of Forbes' 400 richest people in the United States. But the reason I wrote the book and the reason I'm interested in him is because, unbeknownst to almost all his colleagues, except his closest friends, he was on this lifelong spiritual quest. And he was very interested in creating a kind of new worldview for himself. And the really interesting thing is that he had the wealth at the end of his life to basically create a foundation, the Fetzer Institute, to carry on his religious and spiritual vision into the future. So a very interesting, very forward-thinking man.
That's really awesome indeed. I'm a big fan of folks who are forward-thinking, because not all traditions need to be passed down, because some folks may have not had the knowledge or actual thought to actually move forward, or just question why we're doing things this certain way, and how will it actually do us any good if we continue doing it this way, or can we improve it?
Well, that's what Fetzer was all about. He was always on the search, always exploring, always trying out new things and new practices. So even in his last years, he was reading and writing and talking to new people and trying out all sorts of new spiritual ideas and practices.
Yes, sir, indeed. So what did Fetzer mean by spirituality? Because it's kind of a big thing going on with spiritual wealth and folks just turning away from their traditional religions to either no religion or to something totally left field. So what was Fetzer's definition of spirituality?
Well, he believed that all was spirit, that the universe essentially is one thing in its spirit, and it emanates from a great central source that some people call God. And he believed that in a variety of different ways, people could open themselves up to spirit. And since Fetzer was a radio engineer, he always thought of spirit as a kind of energy, and that you could open yourself up to this energy that would basically energize your life. And that would lead you back to the great central source and allow you to transform yourself spiritually, live a good life, maybe even become prosperous. So for him, spirituality was a kind of big idea, but he thought of it in simple terms of the availability of spirit to everyone.
Beautiful indeed, beautiful indeed. And being available to everyone is kind of something that businessmen want to do, and it's kind of interesting how he had like a spiritual definition of wealth and how that actually helped him to become business success. Am I going deeper into that?
Sure. Fetzer always believed that one of the reasons he was successful was that he had very good intuition about making business decisions and choosing the right people to be around him. And he always thought of his intuition as a kind of ESP, a kind of extrasensory perception. So at some level, he had a kind of psychic approach to his businesses, which ultimately paid off. The interesting thing, too, is that he also was happy to use kind of divination devices as well to help him make decisions. He routinely carried around a pendulum, which was simply a weight on a string, and he believed in the power of mind over matter. And so what he would do is, if he had a decision to make that he wasn't sure of, he would pull out the pendulum and ask it a series of yes-no questions, and depending on which way it deflected, it would help him make up his mind in terms of certain business decisions. So he had a kind of psychic approach to it, but in the end, it was really his intuition, which he thought of as a kind of ESP. But the other thing about business was that even though he was tremendously successful and he became very, very wealthy, he himself lived a very frugal life. He didn't have a private jet. He didn't have, the chauffeur-driven limousine. He lived in a very modest tract home here in Kalamazoo. He and his wife lived a very modest life because he really felt that making money wasn't the goal itself, but there had to be a reason for it. There had to be a mission behind it. And for Fetzer, the importance of making money ultimately came down to this idea that it would help him to promote individual spiritual transformation, not only in himself, but in his community and also the nation. And he hoped that by doing that, if enough people became spiritually transformed, there would be a global spiritual transformation. And that's why I talk about the quest for the New Age, because for Fetzer, the New Age was this global spiritual transformation that he really hoped his wealth would help to promote.
Oh, very true indeed, and it actually kind of reminds me of what my pastor likes to say a lot. It takes money to do ministry. It's a lot easier to get a lot more done when you have the funds available to push out your message and to get programs done and all that other good stuff, and to try to reach as many people as possible.
Well, John Fetzer always said, one of his famous sayings was that money is energy. Money is energy. And you need that energy to get stuff done, and money is just one form of it.
Very true indeed. So with compiling all of his wonderful work, how has it affected you as a person?
Well, I'm a professor of comparative religion, as you mentioned, and I study American religious history, and I'm really fascinated by new religious movements, especially here in the Midwest. And I'm fascinated by the way that people put together their worldviews, how individuals might come out of a very traditional background like John Fetzer and decide at some point that they want to take a different path and then construct a new worldview. And the interesting thing about Fetzer is that he left behind a very thorough record of what he read, and he also did some writings that are available. So it was easy for me to construct a very kind of rich narrative about his worldview. And as for me, I think one of the lessons that I learned from John Fetzer was that you should always keep searching, always keep looking, always keep exploring. And I know it's a cliche, but for Fetzer, it was more about the process than necessarily the destination. And I think that kept him young, kept him successful, kept him engaged, and until the end of his life, he was exploring. I think that created a great deal of happiness for him. And so when he finally passed away in 1991, I think he was tremendously proud and tremendously satisfied with what he had accomplished over his many years.
And it's kind of great that he actually did a lot of writing, so that way folks would at least get a view of him long after he was gone. Mm-hmm. So was there any other things that he may have done to keep his legacy alive?
Well, he used his money at the end of his life in the 1970s and 1980s. He began to systematically liquidate his businesses, including selling the Detroit Tigers. And what he did is he took that money, since he didn't have any children, and he endowed a number of different funds. And one of them is the foundation called the Fetzer Institute, which is still very much active today and very successful in promoting John Fetzer's vision. He also created something called the Memorial Trust, the Fetzer Memorial Trust, and that was in part to basically preserve his legacy and his story. So it was the Memorial Trust that asked me to write his spiritual biography. And then the third thing he funded was something called the Franklin Fetzer Fund, and that's to fund research into cutting-edge science, so kind of cutting-edge holistic approaches to physics and biology. And this is pretty high-powered stuff, and I can't claim to understand exactly what they're doing, not being a biologist or a physicist, but it's got some really interesting implications for the understanding of human consciousness and how it interacts with the world. So these three funds, the Fetzer Institute, the Memorial Trust, and the Franklin Fetzer Fund, are all kind of tangible legacies of Fetzer's vision for the future.
Nice. It's always great when you actually can plan out your stuff and then it actually succeeds.
Yeah. Well, for Fetzer, the interesting thing was that he believed in reincarnation, and he believed that he had lived multiple lifetimes before, and that each one of these lifetimes basically contributed to the success of his mission in this life. So he believed that over hundreds, if not thousands of years, he was learning what was necessary, both spiritually and in terms of human interactions, to be able to create an institution that would thrive after his death.
Yes, sir, indeed. Yes, sir, indeed. So what are the institutes doing to further Fetzer's legacy and mission?
Well, in addition to the Franklin Fetzer Fund, which funds the kind of cutting-edge holistic science, and the Memorial Trust, which has an ongoing program of promoting and preserving his legacy, his story, the Fetzer Institute itself is funding a variety of different programs around the nation and internationally as well to promote the inclusion of spirituality into everyday life. So they have a number of programs aimed at, for example, developing the spiritual life of children. and maintaining the spiritual life of seniors, all with the idea that it adds to the quality of life and also the quality of community, which is tremendously important. And another thing they're doing is they have a fairly new program where they're bringing people together to talk about kind of the spiritual roots of democracy. Like a lot of people, they're alarmed by the divisions in the United States today. And their idea is that by getting people to talk about how the spiritual connects with our political system, with democracy, it might help to basically bridge some gaps and get people talking to each other instead of shouting at each other. So this new program is really aimed at kind of healing the heart of democracy.
Oh, yeah. That's well needed today.
Yes, indeed.
Oh, man. Oh, man, indeed. So after compiling all this work, has it inspired you to not only continue your studies, but maybe one day take on one huge project that might just really add to your legacy?
Well, yes. The writing process for this book was so much fun that I just can't wait to get started on a new one. So I have two projects, and one is kind of a short-term project. It's all about the later life of the father of American spirituality, Ralph Waldo Emerson. And so that should be a fun book to do. And then a long-term project is to do a kind of overall history of metaphysical and alternative spiritualities in the Midwest. A lot of people think that California is the place where all this stuff was going on. And it turns out a lot of it began in the Midwest and basically migrated, to the coasts. And so what I want to do is kind of recover that history and talk about how the Midwest has been an incredible kind of place of innovation and incubation for all sorts of new religious movements and new kinds of spirituality. So that's a big project that's probably going to take years to complete. But I love nothing better than spending time in archives and reading old newspapers and old documents. So I'm really looking forward to that project.
Heck, I'm looking forward to it, too. Both of them sound really great, especially Emerson, because his stuff is probably used in probably 95% of the self-help books out there.
Yep. He was the father of it, self-reliance. Yeah.
And especially with the Midwest one, that one definitely makes sense when you think about it, because of the whole gold rush and everybody going over to the West to try to get gold. And I mean, you had to make stops when you're traveling, so you probably picked up some things during your travels and learned some different things about maybe metaphysics or certain spiritual practices that you're probably new to, or that they probably didn't know about and that they just carried over. So that makes total sense right there.
Well, I'm originally from California, born and raised, and so I always had this idea that California was the place where all this stuff was happening. And so when I came to Kalamazoo back in 1996, I was quite frankly kind of flabbergasted that a lot of the stuff that had going on in California in terms of metaphysical and spiritual movements really were born and developed in the Midwest. And as those folks moved west, they took these things with them. And, of course, California was the beneficiary. I
guess the gold wasn't the only thing that came out of California.
That's right. That's right. Well, gold rush we can think of metaphorically as well.
That's true. So backtracking a bit, you were born and raised in California. What led to your studies and becoming a Ph.D.?
Well, originally I studied medical microbiology in college, and I was thinking about going to medical school and becoming a doctor. But I decided that before I did that, then I should really kind of get out there and experience the world a little bit more. So I joined the Peace Corps and did 3 years. And they sent me to Honduras for 2 years. And that was fun because it was a very different cultural environment. And where I was, not only was Roman Catholicism, of course, the dominant religion, but there was also the ruins of the Mayan past. So I got very interested in ancient Mayan religions. And then they sent me to the Dominican Republic for a year. And that, of course, is also a heavily Roman Catholic country. But I lived in a little town that also had a substantial Haitian population. And so they were practicing Roman Catholics, but also some practitioners of voodoo as well. So that was an eye-opener, a very interesting tradition. And so at that point, I decided that I would not go to medical school, but basically devote my life to the study of world religions. And so when I came back, that's what I did, got a Ph.D. at UC Santa Barbara. And for the last 22 years here in Kalamazoo at Western Michigan University, I've been teaching about world religions and religion in the United States.
Nice indeed. So with all of your studies, how many religions you think are out there at the moment, or at least that you've at least found?
Oh, boy, I would hesitate to even put a number to that. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. It's amazing, and they're evolving, and new religions are being created every day. So in the United States, of course, Christianity is the dominant tradition, but we're becoming much more religiously diverse over time. And the other interesting development here is that they do these opinion surveys, and they ask people, well, what religion are you? And the fastest growing demographic is those who say none, which is kind of confusing because then they call this group the nuns, but they're N-O-N-E-S, in that they say they have no religion. But if you drill down a little bit, what you find is that only about 2% of that group, that growing group of people, identify as either agnostic or atheist, and the vast majority of them talk about themselves as spiritual. And they mean different things by that, and in fact they've created this new category, spiritual but not religious, and there's even an acronym, SBNR. And so scholars today are studying this group of people, this demographic, which tends to be fairly young, millennials and younger, and trying to really understand where they're going in their spirituality. And it's not as hyper-individual as people think. A lot of spiritual but not religious people do like to get together in communities in order to explore their spirituality. But the communities tend to be much more informal, and the SBNRs tend to be much more wary of entrenched institutions. So that's why they say they're spiritual but not religious, because they see religion as simply being the institution. So this is a really interesting development, and who knows where it's going to lead in the United States, probably to the creation of all sorts of new religious movements down the road.
Yeah, you're right about that, because I think a lot of folks were raised in certain traditions, and they kind of got sick of it and started using their heads and just wondering why, and no one really knew why, and now they're just basically confused, and they're just out there searching.
Well, yeah, and some go back to their childhood traditions after a while, after exploring, but with a better understanding of that tradition than they had, when they were growing up in it. One of the interesting things about teaching religion here at Western, I mean, this is a state institution, so of course I can't proselytize even if I wanted to, but the whole point is to expose our students to a variety of different religious traditions. And the goal is not to convert anybody to anything, not to try and convince them that one religion is better than another, but just simply so they understand, and they can understand their neighbors who might have very different religious beliefs or no religious beliefs than themselves. So for us, it's really about understanding instead of judging other religious traditions.
Very true indeed, and that's something that a lot of folks seem to have a challenge with, is just understanding like religion, at least making an attempt at it. Some folks are so dogmatic that they don't want to hear anything about any other religion but the one they've been born and raised with.
Yeah, and for a lot of my students who are perfectly comfortable with their childhood religion, what our classes do is by exposing them to other religious traditions, they get to know their own tradition much better, just by the process of comparison. So our students, no matter what they decide down the road, it's I think a really beneficial experience for them.
And out of curiosity, what are your own spiritual beliefs?
Well, I kind of call myself an agnostic seeker, which is a kind of an oxymoron, but describes who I am, I think, because on the one hand, I'm really drawn to all sorts of spiritual traditions and religions as well. But on the other hand, I try and bring kind of a critical approach to things, and haven't really decided that any one is the one for me. So I'm in the perfect profession. And I tell people when they ask me what my religion is, I often tell them it's comparative religion, because it allows me to explore and to continue exploring different religious traditions. Maybe one of these days I'll make a commitment to one, who knows. But for the meantime, I'm having a great time, and there's just so much to learn out there that I won't exhaust the field even if I teach for another 20 or 30 years.
Very true indeed, especially if they start in a church for Instagram and then the scriptures are basically DMs.
Well, who knows? Who knows what social media and all that stuff is going to lead to? Who knows what the development of artificial intelligence is going to lead to? There are all sorts of this used to be just the realm of science fiction, but very quickly it's becoming science fact. So it's an interesting time for somebody to study religion.
That's true indeed. That's true indeed. Well, with your current state of being agnostic, and with your current studies that's ever growing and ever evolving, if you were to go back in time and you were 25 in the current year of 2018, with all of your knowledge and experience, what advice would you give to yourself?
Keep an open mind. Keep searching. I think one of the traps is to get stuck in one mode of being, and you have to realize that you're going to change over your life cycle, and your needs and interests are going to change. So don't think that where you are at 25 is where you're going to be at 50, and just be open to that, and just keep evolving.
Amen to that. Keep evolving indeed. Be the best tree that you can be.
Yep.
Well, all right. For those who want to keep in contact with you, and they may have any questions and want to learn more behind the scenes, behind the wonderful writings of Brian Wilson and John Fetzer, how can we keep in contact with you?
Well, for those who are interested in learning more about the Fetzer Institute, they can go to www.fetzer.org. And for those who want to learn more about the book and the programs of the Memorial Trust, we have a website, www.infinitepotential.com. And if you go there, you can download a free PDF of the preface and first chapter of Johnny Fetzer and the Quest for the New Age. And of course, if you're interested in purchasing the book, it's available as a hardback and also as an ebook on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com and your other online booksellers.
Woohoo! Beautiful. Well, there you have it, folks. The wonderful Brian C. Wilson. Go on ahead and pick up as many copies as you can of the biography of Johnny Fetzer and the Quest for the New Age, and learn some interesting facts of a spiritual mogul who owned a baseball team and then used his funds for the good of man even long after he was gone.
Thanks a bunch for your listening ears on the Going North podcast. I hope you really, really enjoyed that episode. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to share it with your friends and family, especially those who love podcasts and love listening to some inspiration and motivation. And keep a lookout for the sequel to Going North, Tips and Techniques to Advance Yourself in October 2018.